In 1968, inside one of the most respected hospitals in the United States, a woman's screams echoed through an entire research wing so violently, so relentlessly, that nurses stuffed towels under the doors just to muffle the sound. She begged for mercy before sunrise. She begged for sedation before noon. And by hour 3, she was already begging for death. But the experiment had only just begun. Doctors didn't refuse medication because they lacked resources. They refused because pain was the goal, not a side effect. Her suffering wasn't a complication. It was the data. And what will haunt you most is this: everything that was done to her was completely legal under the medical standards of the time. For 6 more days, she stayed alive, kept awake, restrained, conscious, enduring a level of agony that modern laws now classify as torture. Her name was hidden for 35 years. The lead researcher published papers, won awards, and never once faced a courtroom. By the end of this video, you will understand 3 things: why she was chosen, why no one stopped it, and how her suffering quietly changed the rights you have as a patient today. Let's begin. But I'm warning you, this gets darker before it gets clearer. In 1968, America was a country distracted by war, social upheaval, political assassinations, and a medical system that operated under a philosophy nearly unrecognizable today. Doctors were not questioned. Procedures were not explained. Consent was not a discussion, it was a signature, and that signature could be twisted, buried, rewritten, or weaponized. It was the final decade of what historians now call the age of medical paternalism, a time when physicians believed that the patient's understanding was unnecessary. "Doctor knows best" wasn't a comforting slogan, it was a legal shield. The Nuremberg Code existed, yes, but a single loophole rendered it powerless: medical necessity. If a doctor declared a procedure necessary, the question of consent dissolved instantly. Courts accepted this. Hospitals depended on it. Patients never even knew it existed. Behind the polished hallways and respected reputations, something else was unfolding. The Cold War had fostered a generation of researchers obsessed with endurance, stress thresholds, and neurological breakdown under prolonged suffering. Radiation experiments, chemical exposure trials, and psychological endurance tests had been quietly running since the 1940s. Ethics committees. They were still years away. Patient advocacy, not even a concept yet. Medical records belonged not to the patient, but the institution. Into this system walked a 34-year-old woman. For privacy, we'll call her Mary Ann, not her real name, which remained hidden until the early 2000s. Mary Ann was an ordinary woman, a mother, an employee, a patient seeking help. She checked into a hospital she trusted. She signed documents she couldn't understand. She followed every instruction with faith in the system. But hospital archives from the 1990s reveal something chilling. Mary Ann's file was stamped with a discrete marker indicating her eligibility for a research protocol known internally as Procedure 9B. Like most research codes of the era, it sounded benign, neutral, clinical. She had no idea that behind that label was a project designed not to ease pain, but to measure it, to push it, to map its psychological destruction. And she had already met the criteria before she even stepped through the door. By late afternoon on the day of her admission, 3 physicians and a research director had reviewed her chart and agreed she was suitable for sustained observational testing. That phrase appears repeatedly in declassified documents, but nowhere does it define what sustained observational testing actually meant. What it meant, in practice, was that Mary Ann might be restrained, she might be denied medication, she might be pushed to her physical and psychological limits, all while remaining conscious. The hospital informed her family she was being moved to a specialized treatment wing. They didn't question it. Why would they? This was a prestigious institution. These were experienced doctors, and Mary Ann herself believed she was receiving a necessary procedure. What she didn't know was that a single sentence buried deep within the consent form she'd signed, written in dense medical Latin, gave researchers the authority to subject her to temporary distress for scientific advancement. Temporary distress. 2 words that would become the justification for 9 days of unimaginable suffering. Her fate was sealed before she even lay down on the hospital bed. What happened next was not medicine in any form that Mary Ann would have recognized. nor anything her family could have imagined was unfolding just 30 feet from where they drank vending machine coffee and asked polite questions to nurses who had been instructed to say nothing. Before a single needle touched her skin, before the first monitor beeped, the real violation had already occurred. It began the moment hospital staff isolated her from the general ward and moved her into the research wing, a corridor specifically designed for long-duration experiments that required silence, secrecy, and minimal interference. The walls of that wing were soundproofed, not partially, not marginally, but engineered to contain panic, begging, and the raw expressions of human suffering that administrators had no desire for visitors to overhear. The official explanation, should anyone ask, was that the wing housed patients recovering from delicate neurological procedures requiring rest. But the internal memos, later unsealed, showed the darker truth. The wing was designed to guarantee that no sound could compromise research integrity. By 9 p.m., on her first night, Marianne had been assigned a rotating team of 3 physicians, 2 residents, and 1 research coordinator, whose job was not to comfort her or explain the forthcoming procedure, but to ensure that she complied, even if compliance meant nothing more than failing to resist. The lead researcher, a man whose identity remained sealed under legal protection, entered her room with a rehearsed calmness that gave her a false sense of security. He explained that the real treatment would begin early in the morning and that she might experience mild discomfort, a phrase repeated so often and so casually that Marianne had no reason to question it. What he did not tell her was that the hospital had already approved the full sequence of interventions planned for her body, interventions designed not for healing but for observation, for measurement, for the deliberate pushing of human endurance to the brink of psychological collapse. The next morning, at precisely 6:00 a.m., the experiment began with a single order that shattered the boundary between patient and subject. Restrict movement. 4-point restraints, heavy industrial straps originally designed for psychiatric wards during the era of physical containment, were fastened around her wrists and ankles, followed by a thick leather band across her chest to eliminate any possibility of twisting or arching away. Modern viewers might assume such restraints were used only in cases of violent patients, but in 1968, they served another purpose entirely, to guarantee that the subject could not interfere with the data being collected. Marianne asked why so many straps were necessary. The nurse answered with a tight smile and a scripted line about ensuring her safety. The truth, recorded later in internal research notes, was far more chilling. Restraints ensure unaltered pain response during all phases. It was not until 6:45 a.m. that Marianne realized something was terribly wrong. The lead researcher began what the documents describe as a baseline distress induction. Clinical language reduces horror into bureaucracy, but what happened to her was simple. They caused pain deliberately, repeatedly, systematically, and measured her reactions with the cold detachment of men cataloging weather patterns. Her cries, her attempts to negotiate, her instinctive pleas for relief, all of it was recorded, categorized, and timed. These were not the unpredictable reactions of a patient in a medical crisis. They were the expected responses of a human being subjected to controlled suffering. And yet every expression of that suffering was viewed as data rather than tragedy. By hour 3, something shifted in the room. Marianne was no longer asking for help. She was begging not to continue, begging for sedation, begging for death, anything to escape the unbroken assault on her senses. Her voice cracked. Her limbs trembled despite the restraints, and her mind began displaying the early signs of fragmentation that the researchers had been hoping to document. In their notes, written without remorse or hesitation, they recorded the moment clinically. Subject transitions from rational objection to emotional pleading. Threshold point achieved. Continue. That sentence, more than anything else, reveals the truth about what was happening in that room. Her begging was not an obstacle to the experiment. It was the signal to escalate it. And the escalation had only just begun. As the hours stretched into the second full day, the atmosphere inside the research wing shifted from clinical detachment to something far more strained, a tension that lived in the eyes of the nurses long before any of them dared to speak about it. What had begun as a set of neatly structured observations had turned into an unbroken continuum of human suffering that even the staff could no longer rationalize as medicine. Marianne's voice, once strong enough to fill the hallway despite the soundproofing, had begun to fray into cracked syllables that clung to meaning only out of instinct. She no longer bargained incoherent sentences, but instead reached toward the nurses with the fragmented pleas of someone whose mind was being pushed repeatedly against its own breaking point. And yet, every broken word she managed to force out was documented with a precision that still chills modern ethicists. Subject displays transitional collapse in linguistic structure, indicating approach toward cognitive overload. Proceed without sedation. The coldness of such a note reveals everything about the priorities of the men running the experiment. Her suffering was not a sign to intervene. It was confirmation that the experiment was yielding exactly what they wanted. By hour 36, the nurses, particularly the younger ones who had not yet learned the art of emotional detachment, began to show visible cracks in their professional armor. One of them later admitted, during confidential interviews decades after the event, that she would linger outside the room with her hand hovering over the doorknob, trying to gather the strength to enter without physically betraying the dread that pooled in her stomach every time she heard the muffled, wavering sounds from inside. She had taken an oath to heal, to comfort, to alleviate suffering, and now she found herself participating in something that violated the very core of what it meant to be a nurse. Yet she entered the room anyway because hospital hierarchy in 1968 was absolute, and refusal meant immediate dismissal. Her diary entries, uncovered only years later, describe the emotional contortions she endured as she tried to reconcile her training with the instructions she had been given. I told myself this was temporary, that she would recover, that the doctors knew more than I did, but something inside me kept screaming that what I was seeing was not medicine at all, but something hollow and cruel that had disguised itself as science. By hour 48, Marianne's voice dissolved into shallow, unstructured sounds that no longer resembled human speech. The transformation horrified the nurses far more than her earlier screams, because they sensed instinctively that this was not a moment of exhaustion, but a stage the researchers had been anticipating with an almost feverish fascination. When a nurse timidly suggested to the lead researcher that perhaps sedation would be humane, he responded not with anger, but with clinical explanation, as though she were a naive student misunderstanding the purpose of a lesson. He informed her that sedation would contaminate the study's neurological markers, and that they were approaching a rare and valuable threshold in the documentation of post-verbal conscious distress, a phrase that masked the reality that Marianne, still fully aware, had simply exhausted her ability to shape suffering into words. The hospital administration, alerted to the rising complaints among the nursing staff, called a closed-door meeting in which they reminded everyone that Procedure 9B had been vetted at the highest institutional levels and was therefore beyond question. They emphasized obedience, professionalism, and the importance of not allowing personal emotions to interfere with scientific progress. This administrative reinforcement was enough to silence the nurses publicly, but privately their dread only deepened because now they understood that there was no internal authority to appeal to, no senior figure who might intervene, no mechanism at all capable of stopping the escalating cruelty that was unfolding, only a few feet away from where visitors cheerfully asked for directions to the cafeteria. By hour 72, Marianne lay motionless, except for the quick, shallow rise and fall of her chest. Her eyes remained open, tracking movement with a clarity that proved she was still fully conscious, even if her voice had abandoned her. The sounds she produced had thinned into a faint, trembling hum, fragile, involuntary, and devastating to witness. One nurse later described it as the sound of a soul trying to stay tethered to a body that was being pushed past what a human being should ever endure. The researchers, however, viewed her condition through a completely different lens. They categorized her state as optimal for phase escalation, a term that would define the next stage of the experiment. And the next stage would be worse than anything that had come before. By the time the experiment entered its 4th and 5th days, the research wing had transformed into a space defined not by medical purpose, but by a quiet moral collapse that every participant felt, but none dared articulate aloud. The nurses who had initially clung to the belief that the procedure must serve some hidden therapeutic purpose found that justification disintegrating with each shift they worked, because nothing in Marianne's condition resembled treatment, recovery, or progress. Instead, she appeared increasingly hollowed out, suspended between consciousness and psychological disintegration, her mind forcing itself to endure sensations that no human being was ever meant to face without relief. The research notes, written in a detached tone that bordered on the inhuman, documented this deterioration as though it were a fascinating biological phenomenon rather than an unfolding tragedy. Subject demonstrates sustained post-verbal consciousness with stable vitals. Continuation of stimulus response recommended. Those words, cold and precise, gave the researchers permission to ignore every instinct of compassion that tried to surface in the room. It was during these later days that the nurses began to push back in the only ways available to them. They filed internal complaints, each carefully worded to avoid accusations that could destroy their careers, but filled with enough concern to reveal their desperation to halt the ongoing suffering. One nurse requested reassignment, citing emotional strain. Another submitted paperwork questioning whether untreated distress of this severity fell within the bounds of approved research. None of these efforts resulted in meaningful intervention. Instead, the hospital administration responded with memoranda emphasizing institutional loyalty, scientific advancement, and the need to maintain alignment with approved protocol parameters. In other words, the message was clear: the experiment would continue, and anyone who stood in its way risked professional ruin. Meanwhile, only a few walls away, Mary Ann's family sat in the designated waiting area, unaware that their presence existed not as a source of comfort, but as a logistical burden the hospital needed to control. They were updated with vague assurances that she was undergoing intensive treatment that required privacy and rest. Her husband, increasingly uneasy with the evasive language of the staff, asked repeatedly whether he could see her, only to be told that the timing was not appropriate. The nurses who passed the family in the hallway described feeling physically ill at the deception they were forced to uphold. They had seen Mary Ann arch involuntarily under escalating waves of pain. They had watched her eyes track them with silent desperation. They had recorded her vitals while feeling her tremble under restraints. Yet they were forbidden from saying a single truthful word to the people who loved her. The turning point for the nursing staff came when the lead researcher announced that the experiment would be extended by an additional 48 hours due to unprecedented data emerging in the post-verbal phase. To the nurses, this extension signaled not scientific necessity, but profound disregard for Mary Ann's humanity. Several of them later recounted that the moment the extension was declared, the room felt suddenly colder, as if the moral temperature of the institution had dropped. One nurse quietly walked out mid-shift and never returned. Another submitted a resignation that same evening, unable to reconcile her ethical training with the demands of the research protocol. Their departures were met not with concern or introspection, but with administrative efficiency. New nurses were assigned, documents were signed, and the experiment continued without interruption. Mary Ann herself, though silent, remained tragically aware of everything happening around her. Her eyes followed movement with an eerie clarity that haunted every nurse who met her gaze, because they recognized that she was still present, still conscious, still trapped in a body subjected to continuous distress without the possibility of escape. The researchers interpreted her awareness not as a sign to stop, but as confirmation that her condition remained useful for data collection. In their notes, they described her consciousness as stable enough for extended observation, a phrase that now reads like a grotesque inversion of empathy, where stability became a justification for prolonging suffering rather than relieving it. When Mary Ann's husband finally demanded to see her, the hospital orchestrated the moment with calculated precision. They sedated her for the first time since the experiment began, not to ease her suffering, but to conceal it. He entered the room to find her unconscious, quiet, and surrounded by medical equipment that suggested she was undergoing difficult but necessary treatment. He left believing she was in capable hands, unaware that the moment the door closed behind him, the sedation would wear off and the experiment would resume. That deception, perhaps more than any specific procedure, represents the moral rot at the center of the entire ordeal. And yet, despite the physical devastation, despite the psychological unraveling, despite the institutional betrayal unfolding around her, Mary Ann was still alive, and the researchers were not yet finished. On the morning of the 9th day, when most human bodies would have already succumbed to shock, organ failure, or merciful unconsciousness, Mary Ann's vitals began to show subtle but undeniable signs of physiological decline. And even the lead researcher, whose detachment had remained unshaken through every stage of the experiment, wrote in his notes with a rare hint of caution that her condition was approaching a threshold where continuation might jeopardize the very survival they required for the next research phase. It was not compassion that moved him to consider stopping, nor an awakening of conscience, but the simple recognition that a dead subject would yield no further data. The decision to conclude the core experiment was therefore not an act of mercy, but a calculation, a scientific assessment that the primary objectives had been met and that additional suffering risked crossing the line from temporary distress, as they had euphemistically termed it, into irreversible damage that would compromise the recovery metrics they still intended to record. When the restraints were finally loosened and the sedation administered, not as relief, but as a procedural transition, Marianne did not slip into peaceful rest, but instead collapsed inward, her consciousness flickering at the edges like a candle starved of oxygen, her body responding to the first numbing waves of medication with an exhaustion so profound that nurses later said they had never witnessed anything like it. Yet even in that moment of supposed reprieve, her ordeal was not over. The experiment simply shifted into its next phase, one designed to observe the aftermath of prolonged trauma in a waking patient. They monitored how quickly she regained the ability to form words, how long it took for her cognitive functions to reorganize, whether her memory returned in fragmented flashes or coherent sequences. They documented how her body responded to touch, temperature, and routine medical procedures, all while ignoring the truth that these metrics represented not recovery, but the fragile remnants of a mind forced to endure what should have been impossible. The recovery wing, though quieter and staffed by more experienced nurses, did little to shield her from the psychological fallout that manifested in sudden tremors, involuntary gasps, and a deep, recoiling fear whenever footsteps approached her bedside. These reactions were not surprising to the researchers. They had anticipated them, categorized them, and already prepared charts to compare her responses to historical models of trauma. What they failed, or refused to acknowledge, was that Marianne was no longer the person who had walked through the hospital doors 9 days earlier. She was a hollowed version of herself, a woman carrying the imprint of suffering that had carved itself into her nervous system with a precision even the researchers had not expected. When she was discharged, her medical files summarized the entire ordeal with phrases so sanitized they bordered on cruelty. Patient responded adequately to experimental therapeutic intervention. Continued outpatient evaluation recommended. Her family, still unaware of what had unfolded behind the soundproofed walls, took her home believing she had endured a difficult treatment rather than an orchestrated sequence of torment. They saw her trembling hands, her sudden aversion to bright lights, her difficulty forming sentences, and assumed it was part of the healing process. They did not know that these symptoms were the visible echoes of something far darker. The years that followed saw Marianne struggling with symptoms that modern medicine now recognizes as classic manifestations of complex trauma: debilitating flashbacks, sustained anxiety, disrupted sleep cycles, and an instinctive fear of enclosed spaces. Her case became one of the primary catalysts for the medical ethics reforms that swept through hospital systems in the late 20th century, reforms that introduced mandatory oversight committees, standardized consent forms written in plain language, and legal safeguards requiring patient autonomy in all procedures. What she endured, what she survived, reshaped patient rights in nearly 50 countries and became the silent backbone of the protections people now take for granted when signing medical paperwork. Yet despite the far-reaching impact of her suffering, the hospital where the experiment occurred never faced meaningful consequences. Administrators shifted responsibility, researchers defended their actions, and the institution rebranded itself twice, creating a veneer of progress that concealed the truth from anyone who did not know where to look. Marianne's name was eventually released as part of a settlement, her identity no longer hidden behind pseudonyms, yet the full records of what she endured remain sealed by court order, locked away in archives that will not fully open for public review until decades after her death. The ethical debate that surrounds her case continues to challenge modern medicine. Should the detailed documentation of her suffering remain private out of respect for her humanity, or should it be studied openly to prevent future abuses? There is no simple answer, only the uncomfortable acknowledgement that progress is often built on pain, and that the safeguards we rely on today carry the shadows of those who suffered when those safeguards did not yet exist. And as you reflect on this story, remember this: Marianne begged for death after hour 3, Yet the system forced her to endure 6 more days in the name of science. Her survival should never have been possible, but neither should her suffering.